Far away, God knows where, a light flashed in some sentry box that seemed to be standing at the edge of the world. Here, Akaky Akakievich's merriment somehow diminished considerably. He entered the square not without some inadvertent fear, as if his heart had a foreboding of something bad. He looked behind him and to the sides, just like a sea all around him. No, better not to look, he thought, and walked with closed eyes. And when he opened them, to see how far the end of the square was, he suddenly saw before him, almost in front of his nose, some mustached people, precisely what sort he could not even make out. His eyes grew dim, his heart pounded in his chest. "That overcoat's mine," one of them said in a thundering voice, seizing him by the collar. Akaky Akakievich was about to shout, "Help!" when the other one put a fist the size of a clerk's head right to his mouth and said, "Just try shouting." Akaky Akakievich felt only that his overcoat was taken off him. He was given a kick with a knee and fell face down in the snow, and then felt no more. After a few minutes, he came to his senses and got to his feet, but no one was there. He felt it was cold in the field, and the overcoat was gone. He began to shout, but his voice seemed never to reach the ends of the square. In desperation, shouting constantly, he started running across the square, straight to the sentry box, beside which stood an on-duty policeman, leaning on his halberd, watching with apparent curiosity. Desirous of knowing why the devil a man was running toward him from far away and shouting, Akaky Akakievich, running up to him, began shouting in a breathless voice that he had been asleep, not on watch, and had not seen how a man was being robbed. The policeman replied that he had seen nothing, that he had seen him being stopped by two men in the middle of the square, but had thought they were his friends, and that instead of denouncing him for no reason, he should go to the inspector tomorrow, and the inspector would find out who took the overcoat. Akaky Akakievich came running home in complete disorder. The hair that still grew in small quantities on his temples and the back of his head was completely disheveled. His side, chest, and trousers were covered with snow. The old woman, his landlady, hearing a terrible knocking at the door, hastily jumped out of bed and ran with one shoe on to open it, holding her nightgown to her breast out of modesty. But when she opened the door, she stepped back, seeing what state Akaky Akakievich was in. When he told her what was the matter, she clasped her hands and said he must go straight to the superintendent, that the inspector would cheat him, make promises, and then lead him by the nose, and that it was best to go to the superintendent, that he was a man of her acquaintance, because Anya, the Finnish woman, who used to work for her as a cook, had now got herself hired at the superintendent's as a nanny, and that she often saw him herself as he drove past her house, and that he also came to church every Sunday, prayed, and at the same time looked cheerfully at everyone, and therefore was by all tokens a good man. Having listened to this decision, Akaky Akakievich plodded sadly to his room. And how he spent the night we will leave to the judgment of those capable of entering at least somewhat into another man's predicament. Early in the morning he went to the superintendent, but was told that he was asleep. He came at 10 and again was told, asleep. He came at 11 o'clock and was told that the superintendent was not at home. At lunchtime, the scriveners in the front room refused to let him in and insisted on knowing what his business was, what necessity had brought him there, and what had happened, so that finally, for once in his life, Akaky Akakievich decided to show some character, and said flatly that he had to see the superintendent himself in person, that they dared not refuse to admit him, that he had come from his department on official business, and that he would make a complaint about them, and they would see. The scriveners did not dare to say anything against that, and one of them sent to call the superintendent. The superintendent took the story about the theft of the overcoat somehow extremely strangely. Instead of paying attention to the main point of the case, he began to question Akaky Akakievich. Why was he coming home so late? And had he not stopped and spent some time in some indecent house? So that Akaky Akakievich was completely embarrassed and left him not knowing whether the case of his overcoat would take its proper course or not. He did not go to the office at all that day, the only time in his life. The next day he arrived all pale and in his old housecoat, which now looked still more lamentable. Though some of the clerks did not miss their chance to laugh at Akaky Akakievich even then, still the story of the theft of the overcoat moved many. They decided straight away to take up a collection for him, but they collected a mere trifle, because the clerks had already spent a lot having subscribed to a portrait of the director into some book, at the suggestion of the section chief, who was a friend of the author. And so the sum turned out to be quite trifling. One of them, moved by compassion, decided at least to help Akakiy Akakievich with good advice, telling him not to go to the police because, though it might happen that a policeman, wishing to gain the approval of his superior, would somehow find the overcoat, still the overcoat would remain with the police unless he could present legal proofs that it belonged to him. And the best thing would be to address a certain important person, so that the important person, by writing and referring to the proper quarters, could get things done more successfully. No help for it. Akakiy Akakievich decided to go to the important person. What precisely the post of the important person was and in what it consisted remains unknown. It should be realized that this certain important person had become an important person only recently, until then had been an unimportant person. However, his position even now was not considered important in comparison with other still more important ones, but there will always be found a circle of people for whom something unimportant in the eyes of others is already important. He tried, however, to increase his importance by many other means. Namely, he introduced the custom of lower clerks meeting him on the stairs when he came to the office, of no one daring to come to him directly, but everything going in the strictest order. A collegiate registrar should report to a provincial secretary to a titular or whatever else, and in this fashion the case should reach him. Thus everything in Holy Russia is infected with imitation, and each one mimics and apes his superior. It is even said that some titular counselor, when he was made chief of some separate little chancellery, at once partitioned off a special room for himself, called it his, quote, office room, end of quote, and by the door placed some sort of ushers with red collars and galloons, who held the door handle and opened it for each visitor, though the, quote, office room, end of quote, could barely contain an ordinary writing desk. The ways and habits of the important person were imposing and majestic, but of no great complexity. The chief principle of his system was strictness. Strictness, and strictness, he used to say, and with the last word usually looked very importantly into the face of the person he was addressing. Though, incidentally, there was no reason for any of it, because the dozen or so clerks who constituted the entire administrative machinery of the office were properly filled with fear even without that. Seeing him from far off, they set their work aside and waited, standing at attention, until their superior passed through the room. His usual conversation with subordinates rang with strictness and consisted almost entirely of three phrases. How dare you? Do you know with whom you are speaking? Do you realize who is standing before you? However, he was a kind man at heart, good to his comrades, obliging, but the rank of general had completely bewildered him. On receiving the rank of general, he had somehow become confused, thrown off, and did not know how to behave at all. When he happened to be with his equals, he was as a man ought to be, a very decent man, in many respects even not a stupid man, but as soon as he happened to be in the company of men at least one rank beneath him, he was simply as bad as could be. He kept silent, and his position was pitiable, especially since he himself felt that he could be spending his time incomparably better. In his eyes, there could sometimes be seen a strong desire to join in some interesting conversation and circle, but he was stopped by the thought, would it not be excessive on his part? Would it not be familiar? Would he not be descending beneath his importance? On account of such reasoning, he remained eternally in the same silent state, only uttering some monosyllabic sounds from time to time, and in this way he acquired the title of a most boring person. It was to this important person that our Akakiy Akakievich came at a most unfavorable moment, very inopportune for himself, though very opportune for the important person. The important person was in his office and was talking away very, very merrily with a recently arrived old acquaintance and childhood friend, whom he had not seen for several years. Just then it was announced to him that a certain Bajmachkin was there. "Who's that?" he asked curtly. "Some clerk," came the reply. "Ah, he can wait. Now isn't a good time," said the important man. Here it should be said that the important man was stretching it a bit. The time was good. He had long since discussed everything with his friend, and their conversation had since been interspersed with lengthy silences, while they patted each other lightly on the thigh, saying, "So there, Ivan Abramovich. So it is, Stepan Varlamovich." But for all that, he nevertheless told the clerk to wait in order to show his friend, a man who had not been in the service and had been living for a long time on his country estate, what lengths of time clerks spent waiting in his anteroom. At last, having talked, or rather, been silent his fill, and having smoked a cigar in an easy chair with a reclining back, at last he suddenly recollected, as it were, and said to his secretary, who stood in the doorway with papers for a report, "Ah, yes, it seems there's a clerk standing there. Tell him he may come in." Seeing Akaky Akakiyevich's humble look in his old uniform, he turned to him suddenly and said, "What can I do for you?" in a voice abrupt and firm, which he had purposely studied beforehand in his room. Alone and in front of a mirror, a week prior to receiving his present post and the rank of general, Akaky Akakiyevich, who had been feeling the appropriate timidity for a good while already, became somewhat flustered and explained as well as he could, so far as the freedom of his tongue permitted, adding the words, "sort of," even more often than at other times, that the overcoat was perfectly new and he had been robbed in a brutal fashion, and that he was addressing him so that through his intercession, as it were, he could sort of write to the gentleman police and superintendent or someone else and find the overcoat. For some reason, the general took this to be familiar treatment. "What, my dear sir?" he continued curtly. "Do you not know the order? What are you doing here? Do you not know how cases are conducted? You ought to have filed a petition about it in the chancellery. It would pass to the chief clerk, to the section chief, then be conveyed to my secretary, and my secretary would deliver it to me." "But your excellency," said Akaky Akakiyevich, trying to collect the handful of presence of mind he had and feeling at the same time that he was sweating terribly, "I made so bold as to trouble you, your excellency, because secretaries are sort of unreliable folk." "What? What? What?" said the important person. "Where did you pick up such a spirit? Where did you pick up such ideas? What is this rebelliousness spreading among the young against their chiefs and higher-ups?" The important person seemed not to notice that Akaky Akakiyevich was already pushing 50, and so, even if he might be called a young man, it was only relatively, that is, in relation to someone who was 70 years old. "Do you know to whom you are saying this? Do you realize who is standing before you? Do you realize that? Do you realize? I ask you." Here he stamped his foot, raising his voice to such a forceful note that even someone other than Akaky Akakiyevich would have been frightened by it. Akaky Akakiyevich was simply stricken. He swayed, shook all over, and was quite unable to stand. If the caretakers had not come running at once to support him, he would have dropped to the floor. He was carried out almost motionless. And the important person, pleased the effect had even surpassed his expectations, and thoroughly delighted by the thought that his word could even make a man faint, gave his friend a sidelong glance to find out how he had taken it all, and saw, not without satisfaction, that his friend was in a most uncertain state and was even, for his own part, beginning to feel frightened himself. How he went down the stairs, how he got outside, nothing of that could Akaky Akakiyevich remember. He could not feel his legs or arms. Never in his life had he been given such a bad roasting by a general, and not his own general at that. He walked, his mouth gaping, through the blizzard that whistled down the streets, blowing him off the sidewalk. The wind, as always in Petersburg, blasted him from all four sides out of every alley. He instantly caught a quinsy, and he reached home unable to utter a word. He was all swollen and took to his bed. So strong at times is the effect of a proper roasting. The next day he was found to be in a high fever. Owing to the generous assistance of the Petersburg climate, the illness developed more quickly than might have been expected. And when the doctor came, after feeling his pulse, he found nothing else to do but prescribe a poultice. Only so as not to leave the sick man without the beneficent aid of medical science. But he nevertheless declared straight off that within a day and a half it would inevitably be kaput for him. After which he turned to the landlady and said, "And you, dearie, don't waste any time. Order him a pine coffin at once, because an oak one will be too expensive for him." Whether Akakiy Akakievich heard these fatal words spoken, and if he heard them, whether they made a tremendous effect on him, whether he regretted his wretched life, none of this is known, because he was in fever and delirium the whole time. Visions, one stranger than another, kept coming to him. First he saw Petrovich, and ordered him to make an overcoat with some sort of snares for thieves, whom he kept imagining under the bed, and he even called the landlady every other minute to get one thief out from under his blanket. Then he asked why his old housecoat was hanging before him, since he had a new overcoat. Then he imagined that he was standing before the general, listening to the proper roasting, and kept murmuring, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency." Then, finally, he even blasphemed, uttering the most dreadful words, so that his old landlady even crossed herself, never having heard anything like it from him. The more so as these words immediately followed the words, "Your Excellency." After that he talked complete gibberish, so that it was impossible to understand anything. One could only see that his disorderly words and thoughts turned around one and the same overcoat. At last poor Akakiy Akakievich gave up the ghost. Neither his room nor his belongings were sealed, because first, there were no heirs, and second, there was very little inheritance left, namely, a bunch of goose quills, a stack of white official paper, 3 pairs of socks, 2 or 3 buttons torn off of trousers, and the housecoat already familiar to the reader. To whom all this went, God knows. That, I confess, did not even interest the narrator of this story. Akakiy Akakievich was taken away and buried, and Petersburg was left without Akakiy Akakievich, as if he had never been there. Vanished, and gone was the being, protected by no one, dear to no one, interesting to no one, who had not even attracted the attention of a naturalist. Who does not fail to stick a pin through a common fly and examine it under a microscope? A being who humbly endured office mockery and went to his grave for no particular reason, but for whom, all the same, though at the very end of his life, there had flashed a bright visitor in the form of an overcoat, animating for an instant his poor life, and upon whom disaster then fell as unbearably as it falls upon the kings and rulers of this world. Several days after his death, a caretaker was sent to his apartment from the office with an order for him to appear immediately. The chief demanded it. But the caretaker had to return with nothing, reporting that the clerk could come no more, and to the question, "Why?" expressed himself with the words, "It's just that he's already dead, buried 3 days ago." Thus they learned at the office about the death of Akakiy Akakievich, and by the next day, a new clerk was sitting in his place, a much taller one, who wrote his letters not in a straight hand, but much more obliquely and slantwise. But who could imagine that this was not yet all for Akakiy Akakievich, that he was fated to live noisily for a few days after his death, as if in reward for his entirely unnoticed life. Yet so it happened, and our poor story unexpectedly acquires a fantastic ending. The rumor suddenly spread through Petersburg that around the Kalinkin Bridge and far further a dead man had begun to appear at night in the form of a clerk, searching for some stolen overcoat, and, under the pretext of this stolen overcoat, pulling from all shoulders, regardless of rank or title, various overcoats. With cat, with beaver, with cotton quilting, raccoon, fox, bearskin coats. In short, every sort of pelt and hide people have thought up for covering their own. One of the clerks from the office saw the dead man with his own eyes and recognized him at once as Akakievich. This instilled such fear in him, however, that he ran away as fast as his legs would carry him and thus could not take a good look, but only saw from afar off how the man shook his finger at him. From all sides came ceaseless complaints that the backs and shoulders, not only of titular, but even of privy councillors themselves, were completely subject to chills on account of this nocturnal tearing off of overcoats. An order was issued for the police to catch the dead man at all costs, dead or alive, and punish him in the harshest manner, as an example to others. And in this, they nearly succeeded. Namely, a neighborhood policeman on duty had already quite seized the dead man by the collar in Kuryushkin Lane, catching him red-handed in an attempt to pull a frieze overcoat off some retired musician who had whistled on a flute in his day. Having seized him by the collar, he shouted and summoned his two colleagues, whom he charged with holding him while he went to his boot, just for a moment to pull out his snuff box, so as to give temporary refreshment to his nose, frostbitten 6 times in his life. But the snuff must have been of a kind that even a dead man couldn't stand. The policeman had no sooner closed his right nostril with his finger, while drawing in half a handful with the left, than the dead man sneezed so hard that he completely bespattered the eyes of all 3 of them. While they tried to rub them with their fists, the dead man vanished without a trace, so that they did not even know whether or not they had indeed laid hands on him. After that, on-duty policemen got so afraid of dead men that they grew wary of seizing living ones and only shouted from far off, "Hey, you! On your way!" And the dead clerk began to appear even beyond the Kalinkin Bridge, instilling no little fear in all timorous people. We, however, have completely abandoned the certain important person who, in fact, all but caused the fantastic turn taken by this incidentally perfect true story. First of all, justice demands that we say of this certain important person that soon after the departure of the poor, roasted to ashes Akakievich, he felt something akin to regret. He was no stranger to compassion. His heart was open to many good impulses, though his rank often prevented their manifestation. As soon as his out-of-town friend left his office, he even fell to thinking about poor Akakievich. And after that, almost every day, he pictured to himself the pale Akakievich, unable to endure his superior's roasting. He was so troubled by the thought of him that a week later he even decided to send a clerk to him to find out about him and whether he might indeed somehow help him. And when he was informed that Akakievich had died unexpectedly of a fever, he was even struck, felt remorse of conscience, and was in low spirits the whole day. Wishing to divert himself somehow and forget the unpleasant impression, he went for the evening to one of his friends, where he found a sizable company, and, best of all, everyone there was of nearly the same rank, so that he felt no constraint whatsoever. This had a surprising effect on his state of mind. He grew expansive, became pleasant in conversation, amiable. In short, he spent the evening very pleasantly. At supper, he drank 2 glasses of champagne, an agent known to have a good effect with regard to gaiety. The champagne disposed him toward various extravagances. To wit, He decided not to go home yet, but to stop and see a lady of his acquaintance, Karolina Ivanovna, a lady of German origin, it seems, toward whom he felt perfectly friendly relations. It should be said that the important person was a man no longer young, a good husband, a respectable father of a family, 2 sons, one of whom already served in the chancellery, and a comely 16-year-old daughter with a slightly upturned but pretty little nose, came every day to kiss his hand, saying, "Bonjour, Papa." His wife, still a fresh woman and not at all bad-looking, first gave him her hand to kiss and then, turning it over, kissed his hand. Yet, the important person, perfectly satisfied, incidentally, with domestic family tenderness, found it suitable to have a lady for friendly relations in another part of the city. This lady friend was no whit better or younger than his wife, but there exist such riddles in the world, and it is not our business to judge of them. And so the important person went downstairs, got into his sleigh, and said to the driver, "To Karolina Ivanovna's," and himself wrapped quite luxuriantly in a warm overcoat, remained in that pleasant state, than which no better could be invented for a Russian man when you are not thinking of anything, and yet thoughts come into your head by themselves, each more pleasant than the last, without even causing you the trouble of chasing after and finding them. Filled with satisfaction, he kept recalling all the gay moments of that evening, all his words that had made the small circle laugh. He even repeated many of them in a half-whisper and found them as funny as before. And therefore it was no wonder that he himself chuckled heartily. Occasionally, however, a gusty wind interfered with him, suddenly bursting from God knows where, and for no apparent reason cutting at his face, throwing lumps of snow into it, hoisting the collar of his coat like a sail, or suddenly, with supernatural force, throwing it over his head, thereby causing him the eternal trouble of extricating himself from it. Suddenly, the important person felt someone seize him quite firmly by the collar. Turning around, he noticed a short man in an old, worn-out uniform, in whom, not without horror, he recognized Akakia Akakievich. The clerk's face was pale as snow, and looked exactly like a dead man's. But the important person's horror exceeded all bounds when he saw the dead man's mouth twist and, with the horrible breath of the tomb, utter the following words: "Ah! Here you are at last. At last I've sort of got you by the collar. It's your overcoat I need. You didn't solicit about mine, and roasted me besides. Now give me yours." The poor, important person nearly died. However full of character he was in the chancellery and generally before subordinates, and though at a mere glance at his manly appearance and figure everyone said, "Oh, what character!" Here, like a great many of those who are powerful in appearance, he felt such fear that he even became apprehensive, not without reason, of some morbid fit. He quickly threw the overcoat off his shoulders and shouted to the driver in a voice not his own, "Home at top speed!" The driver, hearing a voice that was usually employed at decisive moments and even accompanied by something much more effective, drew his head between his shoulders just in case, swung his knout, and shot off like an arrow. In a little over 6 minutes, the important person was already at the door of his house, pale, frightened, and minus his overcoat. He came to his own place instead of Karolina Ivanovna's, plodded to his room somehow or other, and spent the night in great disorder. So that the next morning over tea, his daughter told him directly, "You're very pale today, Papa." But Papa was silent. Not a word to anyone about what had happened to him or where he had been or where he had wanted to go. This incident made a strong impression on him. He even began to say, "How dare you? Do you realize who was before you?" far less often to his subordinates. And if he did say it, it was not without first listening to what the matter was. But still more remarkable was that thereafter the appearances of the dead clerk ceased altogether. Evidently, the general's overcoat fitted him perfectly. At least there was no more talk about anyone having his overcoat torn off. However, many active and concerned people refused to calm down and kept saying that the dead clerk still appeared in the more remote parts of the city. And indeed, one policeman in Kolomna saw with his own eyes a phantom appear from behind a house, but being somewhat weak by nature, so that once an ordinary adult pig rushing out of someone's private house had knocked him down, to the great amusement of the coachmen standing around, for which jeering he extorted a half kopeck from each of them to buy snuff. So, being weak, he did not dare to stop it, but just followed it in the darkness, until the phantom suddenly turned around, stopped, and asked, "What do you want?" and shook such a fist at him as is not to be found even among the living. The policeman said, "Nothing," and at once turned to go back. The phantom, however, was much taller now and had an enormous mustache. And apparently making its way toward the Apukov bridge, vanished completely into the darkness of the night.